Pope Francis's first major document, The Joy of the Gospel, has created a media firestorm. Is he condemning capitalism, revolutionizing the papacy? We'll explore it in depth with Bishop Robert Morlino of Madison, Wisconsin. And U.S. diplomacy at the Vatican is at a crossroads as the Obama administration decides to merge the U.S. Embassy to the Holy See into the Italian Embassy. Is this a diminishment of the U.S.-Vatican relationship? Former Vatican ambassadors Jim Nicholson and Ray Flynn weigh in. And finally, attorney and child advocate Liz Yore returns to talk about the newly established Vatican Commission for the Protection of Children from Sexual Abuse and the ongoing problem of global human trafficking. The World Over Live begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Bishop Robert Morlino, Ambassadors Ray Flynn and Jim Nicholson, as well as Liz Yore, are all straight ahead. As always, if you'd like to weigh in on tonight's program, send your tweets to Raymond Arroyo or drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. Lots to get to, but first, here's the brief, the news from the world over this week. Nelson Mandela, anti-apartheid icon and South Africa's first black president, died on Thursday. He was 95 years old. Mandela became one of the world's most beloved statesmen when he emerged from 27 years in prison to negotiate an end to white minority rule in South Africa. In February of 1990, Mandela was freed. Blacks across the country erupted in joy, as did many whites. Mandela took charge of the African National Congress, shared the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize, and was elected president by a landslide in South Africa's first all-race election the following year. His death closes the final chapter on Africa's struggle to cast off white rule, leaving the world with indelible memories of a man of peace and enduring faith. South African President Jacob Zuma made the announcement at a news conference saying, "We've lost our greatest son." May Nelson Mandela rest in peace. More trouble for the Christian population in Syria. On Monday, jihadist rebels abducted 12 nuns in the town of Ma'alula, just outside of Damascus. Approximately 40 Greek Orthodox sisters run an orphanage there. Rebels and forces loyal to President Assad have been fighting for control of Ma'alula for months. Many Christians have already left the area as they've been the repeated targets of Islamist rebels. In September, 3 Catholic men from the same town were slain by jihadists. Pope Francis asked Catholics to pray for the 12 nuns during his Wednesday audience. The Syrian Greek Orthodox Patriarch is pleading for the nuns' release. Meanwhile, Oklahoma's Attorney General said this week that his state's legal claim against the Affordable Care Act could mean the end of Obamacare altogether. Scott Pruitt told me earlier this week that his lawsuit and those of several other states are challenging the federal tax penalties created by the law for those who fail to sign up for health care insurance. The lawsuits argue that the Affordable Care Act explicitly stipulates that tax penalties and subsidies are only allowed in those states that offer exchanges. The law says nothing about penalties or subsidies for states that do not offer their own exchanges. Since only 14 states have set up these exchanges, according to Pruitt, if the lawsuits are successful, Obamacare would lose $700 billion over the next decade, and thus, without this funding mechanism, the structure of the ACA would crumble, he says. A U.S. district judge in Washington, D.C. will hear the case in February. The Obama administration says Congress intended to provide insurance to everyone, and therefore national subsidies and penalties are needed. And a new lawsuit has been filed against the administration over the contraception mandate in the health care law. On Tuesday, the University of Notre Dame filed another lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the Department of Health and Human Services mandate, forcing it to include contraception, abortifacients, and sterilizations in its student and employee health care plans. Notre Dame President Father John Jenkins said that the requirement would compel Notre Dame to forfeit its rights and become entangled in a program inconsistent with Catholic teaching. Also filing suit against the mandate on Tuesday, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, better known as FOCUS. Pope Francis on Monday met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. According to the Vatican, the two spent most of their 30-minute conversation focused on the complex political and social situation in the Middle East. During the audience, Netanyahu confirmed his invitation to Pope Francis to visit the Holy Land, which is planned for this coming spring. Among the gifts offered by Netanyahu, a book by his late father entitled The Origins of the Spanish Inquisition. The Israeli leader inscribed the book to His Holiness Pope Francis, a great shepherd of our common heritage. Key votes on some major social issues occurred across Europe this past week. By a near 2-to-1 landslide, Croatian voters on Sunday effectively banned gay marriages, enshrining the traditional definition of marriage into the nation's constitution. The measure passed despite the opposition of both the president and prime minister of Croatia. The referendum was called after Croatia's center-left government drafted a law allowing gay couples to register as life partners. Church leaders got behind the ballot campaign, urging the faithful to vote yes. Nearly 90% of Croatians are Roman Catholic. And the French Parliament on Wednesday overwhelmingly favored a bill that attempts to curtail prostitution and fight human trafficking networks. The proposed law would fine customers $2,000 and decriminalize the estimated 40,000 prostitutes in France. The bill would further make it easier for foreign prostitutes to remain legally in the country should they join a program to exit the sex trade. Prostitution is legal in France, but soliciting, pimping, and sex with minors are prohibited. Sex workers and their union oppose the measure. President François Hollande's socialist government strongly backs the bill. And a troubling story, 2 Senate panels in Belgium have approved a bill that would legalize euthanasia for terminally ill children with the consent of the child and the parent. The Belgian church is opposing the measure, as it did in 2002, when euthanasia for adults was legalized. The bishops and other religious leaders sent an open letter to the Senate urging better palliative care and help alleviate suffering. They question whether children can reasonably decide to end their own lives. Final parliamentary approval is expected in the coming months. And it might only be the first week of Advent, but it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Back at the Vatican on Thursday, an 80-foot, 7.2 metric ton Christmas tree from Bavaria appeared. It was erected in St. Peter's Square. Every year, a Christmas tree is donated by a different country and transported to the Vatican for display. The Bishop of Regensburg said, "We're proud to be able to bring a Christmas tree from the center of Europe to the center of Christianity." The tree will be decorated and lit in the coming days. And behind me, here at the Capitol on Tuesday, House Speaker John Boehner and several dozen school-aged carolers are on hand to illuminate the Capitol Christmas tree. The 88-foot spruce from Washington State is the second tallest tree ever used at the Capitol. It was decorated with more than 5,000 handmade ornaments by children across the country. It's very pretty. When we return, Pope Francis released his first Apostolic Exhortation, and he sparked headlines, praise, and outrage around the world. I know you and your friends are discussing it. What did the Pope really say? We'll unpack it for you with Bishop Robert Morlino of Madison in studio. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Pope Francis' recent apostolic exhortation, "The joy of the gospel is a stem winder." The 217-page document has caused a media firestorm and, depending upon the point of view, garnered as much adulation as derision. Where reports have focused on the Pope's comments about trickle-down economics and decentralization of power in the Vatican, they've missed the overarching thrust of the document, a call to vibrant evangelization and an encounter with Christ. To explore the document in depth and get beyond the headlines, we're joined by the Bishop of the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin, not to mention a former Jesuit, Bishop Robert Morlino. I guess you're still a Jesuit.
So good to see you,
Great
Raymond.
to see you,
Very
Bishop.
much so.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming in. Now, I want to get right into this document. It has caused so much confusion on so many levels, and I think a lot of it has to do with it's such a dense document. Very few people have spent the time reading it page for page, so they rely on the media reports, and those have pulled out the more inflammatory lines or the lines that are more apt, I think, to be misinterpreted. Yes. The Pope says at one point that this document has a programmatic significance and important consequences, that it's not just some rumination or a lower form of papal teaching, is it?
No, not at all. And the fact that it has a programmatic significance, a programmatic significance is different from a doctrinal significance. And if I may say, I have been praying a lot, and I'm speaking now just for myself, not for any other bishop or for the church, just for myself. Pope Francis has sent me to more intense prayer, and that's always a good thing. That's a great way for him to strengthen the brethren, as Jesus said to St. Peter. But as I've been pondering all of this in prayer, what's struck me over and over and over again is that it wouldn't be proper to call this a teaching document, a teaching document about doctrine. Now, given the long history of John Paul the Great and then Benedict to follow him, we have been on a very strict diet, pretty much, of teaching documents.
Right.
And they've been excellent, and the clarity is superb.
Primarily motu proprios, which are documents issued on the Pope's authority, and the encyclicals. Those are kind of the top tier of teaching documents.
And as John Paul had tremendous philosophical depth and clarity, so Benedict had tremendous theological depth and clarity. And I believe that Francis is very comfortable accepting the body of doctrine that's been taught. And I think in accepting that and not making the clarification of doctrine his top priority, he is in a way following the hermeneutic of continuity. Because he's saying, I don't have to do any of that.
That the teaching's already been established.
It's established.
So what is he doing here?
And that's what he always says is, I'm a son of the Catholic Church. That's what he answers when people challenge him. I'm a son. I believe him. And I think Francis is trying to jar us, shake us up. He's certainly done it to me. And dislodge us from our ordinary place from which we pray and think and everything else, so that, what does he tell us to do once we get dislodged? Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus.
It is like a mini retreat in some ways.
And I think that's what he wants us to do. And so I don't look for clarification of doctrine. There is enough ambiguity in what he writes, and there are seemingly different positions about the same doctrines in what he writes. But I think what he's trying to do is evangelize in this sense. Before we can open people really to look at Jesus, we've got to remove them from their own safe places. And I presume that the doctrine which has been so clearly taught by John Paul and by Benedict and by all the councils of the Church stands. So, and that he's really not trying to get at that, but rather a programmatic, he said. Programmatic for what? For teaching doctrine? I don't think so. Programmatic for getting people to have that first face-to-face meeting with Jesus Christ risen from the dead.
And this really feels like, when you read it through, those of us who are familiar with his, the thrust of his homilies, from the very first day to the present, this feels like an unabridged compendium of all of his daily homilies, really.
Yes.
And when I read it through, I thought, I've heard these words, I've heard this construction before. It has that feel. At one point, he summarizes what I think is the entire pontificate, or the main message of it. And it's a call that was evident in those early homilies. Let me say this once more, Pope Francis writes. God never tires of forgiving us. We are the ones who tire of seeking His mercy. And then he goes on and he says, Christians should be people who wish to share their joy, who point to a horizon of beauty, and who invite others to a delicious banquet. It is not by proselytizing that the church grows, but by attraction. Consequently, an evangelizer must never look like someone who's just come back from a funeral. He calls those people sourpusses. Has the church lost its attractiveness? And is that what he's making us aware of in the thrust of this evangelical call?
Well, the division in the church has certainly drained us of joy. I can't omit mentioning this to you. Someone suggested, when he mentioned the delicious banquet, somebody's asked me if I wrote that passage, and I assured that I didn't.
Okay.
But I do think about delicious banquets occasionally.
Me too.
But no, I think the division is what he is trying to free us from. Let the Lord use him to free us from all of those places where the division foments within us. And I think right now, with the clarity that we have of doctrine from the last two pontificates, I think he couldn't render us a greater service, really.
Let's talk about the essentials, and he brings this up in the course of the document. Here's the quote. Pastoral ministry in a missionary style is not obsessed with the disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed. The message has to concentrate on the essentials, on what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time, most necessary. The message is simplified while losing none of its depth and truth, and thus becomes all the more forceful and convincing. That really describes his public witness of the faith, isn't it? And
I think that's a very Benedictine kind of passage, because he's talking about the identity of beauty and truth, the attractiveness of beauty, the forcefulness of truth, and he is echoing Benedict's constant theme, we don't impose, we propose.
Yeah.
That sounds very familiar and very continuous to me.
I think of my friend Father Richard Newhouse, who always used that phrase. He also had this to say, and I found this curious and interesting, and it's almost a papal disclaimer. So when he goes on to talk about other things, it's almost in this light. Here's the line. It's gotten no media coverage. Countless issues involving evangelization today might be discussed here. And again, this is about evangelization. But I have chosen, the Pope writes, not to explore these many questions which call for further reflection and study, nor do I believe that the papal magisterium should be expected to offer a definitive or complete word on every question which affects the Church and the world. It's not advisable for the Pope to take the place of local bishops in the discernment of every issue which arises in their territory. In this sense, I'm conscious of the need to promote a sound decentralization. What's he saying there?
I think he's saying what John Paul said in Apostolos Suos about the relationship of individual bishops to the conference.
Right.
And that is that the bishop has to remain the teacher, the governor, the liturgical celebrant in his own diocese, period. And he always has to remain in union with the Holy Father. But local problems are best dealt with locally, though we don't want to overdo subsidiarity with regard to the Church. That would be another mistake.
Right.
But I think he's talking about pastoral problems, and I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that. But it's interesting that Apostolos Suos of John Paul upheld the authority of the local bishop, while admitting the unique role of the Pope, so that the bishop must be in communion with him.
He mentioned something else, and I know this is an issue dear to your heart, and something that he sounded when you were with him recently. He talks about diversity and the role of the Holy Spirit. Differences between persons and communities, the Pope writes, can sometimes prove uncomfortable. But the Holy Spirit, who is the source of that diversity, can bring forth something good from all things and turn it into an attractive means of evangelization. Diversity must always be reconciled by the help of the Holy Spirit. He alone can raise up diversity, plurality, and multiplicity, while at the same time bringing about unity. When we, for our part, aspire to diversity, we become self-enclosed, exclusive, and divisive. Similarly, whenever we attempt to create unity on the basis of our human calculations, we end up imposing monolithic uniformity. This is not helpful for the Church's mission. You discovered this when you were with him.
Absolutely. He was talking very much about desirable diversity and undesirable diversity. And the undesirable diversity is, of course, what we here in our culture called diversity. It's anything goes. I think the bad diversity is the disunity in the church, where the church looks like the American political scene, liberals and conservatives. And I think too often we live and we pray out of our liberal or conservative position, and we kind of get stuck in a rut. He means that unique blend of diversity that celebrates itself in unity, because there is both truth and beauty in that diversity. And of course, when our culture uses the word diversity, frequently enough there's neither beauty nor truth there.
Let's get into some of the more controversial bits here, which I want to put into context. There's been a lot of talk about his economic theory, the Pope's musings on that. Here's the context. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition, he writes, and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. Human beings are themselves considered consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We have created a throwaway culture, which is now spreading. In this context, he goes on to write, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized working of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. Bishop Morlino, some on the right have suggested that this is pure Marxism. I've gotten emails since this came out saying the church is taking us towards socialism. Is that what he's doing?
Well, in the first place, that issue of the translation needs to be resolved, because whether or not, quotes, unfettered capitalism inevitably leads to is an issue. The other possible translation is they claim that unfettered capitalism by itself brings about. And of course, no single whatever by itself will heal this problem.
Correct.
And so I think the translation needs to be clarified. But I think, again, Benedict is not trying, Pope Francis is not trying to revise the teaching of John Paul in Solicitudo Rei Socialis. I think whatever he writes has to be understood in that context, and that he's saying that economy is really at the service of the person and is to be lived out in solidarity. That is, there is a moral component to it, and we can't pretend that markets by themselves would achieve the moral goodness of economic behavior, because it can't happen.
Now, Sam Gregg of the Acton Institute, of course, people know Father Robert Sirico from the show. Sam Gregg has written and said, look, opening up markets have helped to reduce poverty and create new opportunities and end poverty, particularly in Eastern Asia. And he's pointed out also that when the Pope mentions this notion of unfettered markets, open markets, free markets, autonomous markets, that there really is no such thing, that all markets are regulated, particularly in the Western world. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it does seem that unfettered capitalism is a concept rather than something concrete that you find here or there. But again, the Pope is stirring up the waters. He is not teaching or revising the doctrine of solicitudo rei socialis.
Let me ask the question, because I've gotten this question so often this week. How binding is a document like this on the individual Catholic? And I'm not talking about the moral teachings. I'm talking about economic theory musings and ideas on anything from cuisine to entertainment.
Well, the papal magisterium can rise to the level of infallibility only in matters of faith and morals. And this kind of an economic judgment would not qualify as something that is to be held by all the faithful. It's a prudential judgment that the Pope seems to be making an offering. But again, he is stirring up the waters and saying, think about how you live your economic life. Do you live as though there were unfettered capitalism, or do you live in hope of it? How do you live your life? Do you live your life in terms of survival of the fittest, or what do you do?
Right.
And why don't you loosen up your connection to whatever you're tied down to and stare Jesus in the eye?
Yeah, it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
It's a real challenge to people. And I do think he's trying to focus us on those who are poor, those who are in need, and perhaps our everyday ignoring them, which happens so often. And I'll call myself out as well. How many homeless people do I pass on the way to work every day? All of us. It should be said, Bishop, and this has gotten virtually no coverage, the Pope states at one point that welfare projects should be temporary responses, he says, and warns against a welfare mentality. What does he mean there? This sort of runs afoul of a lot of the media coverage.
Well, again, he's saying that once people lose control of major portions of their lives, their freedom to be the best that they can be, their freedom to seek human flourishing, including religiously, evidently becomes narrowed. And we see that very clearly in the Health and Human Services mandate that we're under, where here, as we move toward almost a welfare situation in healthcare, we see that the curtailment of religious liberty and other liberty seems to be part and parcel of a system where that type of life is available to everybody and becomes popular. We should always have a safety net. Health care should always be accessible, basic health care, always. But it should be available as a safety net, not as a kind of a general lifestyle that almost discourages people to seek real human flourishing.
Right, to be free and creative, as he says at another place, and to find their noble vocation, which he sounds off on.
Right.
Let's move on to something he writes about abortion and the care of women in crisis. He writes, among the vulnerable for whom the Church wishes to care with particular love and concern are unborn children, the most defenseless and innocent among us. Nowadays, efforts are made to deny them their human dignity and to do with them whatever one pleases, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this. It is not progressive to try to resolve problems by eliminating a human life. On the other hand, it's also true that we have done little to adequately accompany women in very difficult situations where abortion appears as a quick solution to their profound anguish, especially when the life developing within them is the result of a rape or a situation of extreme poverty. Your thoughts on that citation?
Well, I agree with that very strongly. I do think that many dioceses now have structures that will help the woman with an unplanned pregnancy to be housed, to receive medical care, and to be taught parenting skills.
Yeah.
There are such arrangements in most dioceses that I'm very familiar with, which is not to say we're doing enough. We could never do enough in this regard. But this is where the Church can really step forward. You know, if our religious freedom is protected, this is where we can really step forward and do a great deal for these women. And we've always wanted to. We've always wanted to not only beg women not to have an abortion, but we've always wanted to offer them a viable alternative to bringing forth a new life and getting the proper medical care and the parenting classes and all that goes with being a mother.
At another point in this document, this exhortation, the Pope calls for a sound decentralization of the papacy. This has been interpreted by some as meaning the Pope is going to open up authority, allow a more generous decision-making. Is that what he's doing here?
Well, again, I think that the teaching of Apostolos Suo stands. I think that bishops can resolve local problems, but they always must do so in a way that preserves their union with Peter, with the Holy Father. They have to. It, I think, is very clear, even if we look at voting patterns in the Conference of Catholic Bishops, that bishops have different approaches to the same thing, and that if we were to move this way in the area of doctrine, the doctrine would quickly become muddied, I'm afraid, because of diversity of doctrinal teaching among bishops. And that sometimes creeps in, even though every bishop wants to believe that he's in communion with Peter and with his brother bishops. He wants to believe that. He's trying to do that, but sometimes it clearly doesn't work out.
And Peter has to be the final word.
Right.
Bishop Robert Morlino, thank you so much for being here. Always
God
a
love
pleasure.
you, Raymond.
Thank
Enjoy.
you. Thank you. You can keep up with Bishop Morlino's columns at the Diocese of Madison at his website, madisondiocese.org. It's catchy. Up next is the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and the Holy See in jeopardy after a new State Department decision. Two former Vatican ambassadors believe it is. Raymond Flynn, who served under Bill Clinton, and Jim Nicholson, who served under George W. Bush, join us when The World Over Live continues. Don't miss it.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. The Obama administration has decided to move the U.S. Embassy up to the Vatican from a freestanding location to a compound within the U.S. Embassy to Italy. The move has been decried by everyone from Bill Donahue at the Catholic League to many former U.S. ambassadors to the Holy See, including the two men joining us tonight, to discuss the status of the diplomatic relations with the Holy See and the impact of this decision. I'm joined via satellite from Boston by the former ambassador to the Holy See under President Clinton, Democrat Raymond Flynn. And here in studio, the former ambassador under George W. Bush, Republican Jim Nicholson. Thank you both for being here. I want to start with you, Ambassador Flynn. The State Department says, look, this is not based on anything other than practical realities. We have a safety crisis with our embassies. This will be a safer location at the Embassy for Italy, folding in the Holy See mission there. It makes more sense financially. We're saving $1 million. You'll have larger office space. What's the problem?
Well, if that were the only issue that of controversy, that would be an argument that people would listen to. But there's a pattern here. There's a pattern of inconsistencies, religious mandates by government, religious persecution, people telling in Washington, telling Catholics and religious leaders what they can do, what they can't do, and a voice of silence when there's persecution of Christians, Catholics in the Middle East and bombing of churches. So there's a controversy here that collectively it doesn't hold water when this latest decision is made by the White House and the State Department. And frankly, I think Jim Nicholson has said it as well as anybody. It diminishes the prestige and the influence of the Catholic Church worldwide if the most important country in the world is withdrawing its support or moving its prestigious embassy and consolidating with another embassy at the Republic of Italy.
Ambassador Nicholson, in what way does this diminish the relationship? The State Department saying, look, we've got our first Catholic Secretary of State. This is not a diminishment at all. We're not downgrading it in any way. It's not feasible.
That defies common sense. I mean, if you move it from a freestanding, separate building in a beautiful location in Rome where it receives diplomats from other countries, people from the Vatican who come on diplomatic business, visitors from America, congressmen. The president came to Rome 3 times when I was the ambassador. And to move it inside the compound to the Republic of Italy and put it in an office building where you have to walk down a narrow sidewalk and into a hallway to get to what used to be the chancery of the United States Embassy to the Vatican is a clear diminishment of its stature. And when you diminish stature, you diminish influence.
I thought the Vatican required that any mission to the Holy See have a separate address and a separate entrance from the mission to Italy.
They do require it, and they are technically going to have that. That's not hard to have a separate entrance and then give it a separate address. But it's in a building that was bought by the U.S. as an office annex to the main embassy building while I was in Rome. And they wanted, by the way, they wanted us to move in there then.
And why didn't it happen?
It didn't happen because I saw it to be a very bad idea for the U.S. in our interests, and the president agreed with me.
Ambassador Flynn, what can you achieve? What did you achieve as ambassador to the Holy See in a standalone embassy that you think might be complicated by this merger?
Well, as Jim said, the stature, the standing of the United States in its important diplomatic relationship with the Vatican sent a message throughout the world when this was first established under President Ronald Reagan in 1984. And what we were able to do is we were able to bring in diplomats accredited to the Holy See from all across the world, bring them to our embassy, talk about troubled spots, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be earthquakes in India, a civil war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Haiti. And we were able to have these sit-down discussions, the representative, the presidents of the United States, the representative of these various countries, and the Catholic Church, the world's most important listening post. That brought an enormous amount of credibility out of the limelight, too, and we were able to effectively get a lot of things done.
Would you agree with that, Jim Nicholson?
I definitely would agree with that. I mean, Ray makes a very important point there, is that that building, housed our embassy, and our first ambassador was Ambassador Wilson. And President Reagan finally got full diplomatic relations because he saw the value of the Vatican and the Pope in helping him bring down the Soviet Union, which is what defined his presidency. That building, by the way, also housed the peace talks that brought about the peace settlement in Mozambique, in Africa, a peace treaty that has held. This makes no sense on any grounds. I mean, they're arguing that it's going to save $1 million. I'd like people to take a look at a piece of so-called sculpture that the U.S. just bought to put on the lawn of the embassy to the United Kingdom. Paid $1 million for it, and it looks like a bunch of slabs of granite. They say that this will be closer. It's maybe closer by the way the crow flies by 1 or 2/10 of a mile. So I think they're quite desperate for specious, sort of meaningless trivial arguments about this.
So it seems your collective point is this is perception, and that other countries, as well as the Holy See, will see this as a slight? Is that what you're saying? And therefore look suspiciously on the relationship or the bond of the relationship between the Holy See and the United States?
This is an anomaly. I mean, look at the ascendancy of the current Pope. I mean, can you tell me who the Prime Minister of Italy is? You probably can, but most people couldn't. Right. And I don't mean to denigrate Italy any in this.
Sure.
But everybody can tell you who the Pope is. And this is an important world figure. And this is your job when you're the ambassador of the Holy See, to be the president and the country's interlocutor with this important figure that has communion with 1.6 billion Catholics, but with millions and billions of other people, because they're about what we are. They're trying to bring more prosperity and peace and freedom to people around the world.
Ambassador Ray Flynn, you wanted to say what?
Yeah, I wanted to say that in my experiences traveling throughout the world on behalf of the presidents and the government of the United States, and having that portfolio of being the president's representative to the Catholic Church, and having the personal relationship that I've had with John Paul II, that opened an enormous door for me to get things done, to be taken seriously, to have that level of credibility. We don't want to go backwards on that. Whether you be Democrat or Republican, this isn't a partisan issue. This isn't a political issue. This is about what is best for the United States, what is best for diplomatic relations with countries throughout the world, and the most important diplomatic voice, a voice that has no political objective or geographic objective, the Catholic Church. They can be an enormous, effective, helpful partner in the United States diplomatic mission.
Ray Flynn and Jim Nicholson, I want to return to something that Ambassador Flynn mentioned when we started this conversation. Do you believe that this is retribution? This is retributive against somehow, it's the administration sort of taking it out on the Holy See mission because of the recent conflict over HHS mandates, the healthcare conflict, religious liberty battles, as Bill Donahue and others have suggested?
I'm not sure. If I wanted to take a more benevolent interpretation of it, I think it just shows the, rather than antipathy, just the apathy that this administration has about the importance and the relevance of the Catholic Church writ large throughout the world, and the Holy See. This is one of the most important and oldest diplomatic posts in the world. And there's about 170 countries over there that are accredited to the Holy See. Almost every Middle Eastern country, almost every African country has a full diplomatic relationship there with an embassy. Separate.
Ray Flynn, would you agree with that? Or do you read some darker...
you know what?
Go ahead.
Well, you know, Raymond, when I see the strained relationship that the United States has diplomatically with other countries, particularly in the Middle East, it would suggest to me that would be in the United States' interest to have the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Holy Father, the Pope, have that institution as an ally in the war on the objective of peace and stability in the world, not to create this image that we're distancing ourselves, we're distancing ourselves from the most important moral voice in the world. Look, there's no person I would rather stand on the stage, the international stage, to proclaim peace and justice, as Pope Francis advocates, than having the presidents of the United States and the international community standing on the stage, same international stage, advocating for this, to separate this, to give the impression that you're going this way, we're going that way, we're creating a different path. I just think it sends the wrong message entirely from a United States point of view, not just the world point of view, but a United States point of view.
Jim Nicholson.
Well, I think Ray makes a very important point there. The precedent that this is setting. I mean, in every diplomatic gathering, people always look to the United States to see what the United States thinks and what the United States is going to do. We often provide important resources for any, follow-up for decisions. And for the United States to be doing this downgrade and making this embassy a stepchild of the embassy to Italy is a terrible precedent.
But it looks like it's going to happen. I've spoken to a number of congressmen this week. They are agitated about this. Do you expect congressional action?
I know there's a great deal of interest on the Hill about this right now. I've spoken to several members of Congress.
Ray Flynn, should there be congressional action?
Could I say something?
Sure.
Not only congressional action, Raymond, but I think there has to be action by lay Catholics throughout the United States. Frankly, and I'll be blunt, I am a little tired of lay Catholics sitting on their rear end, doing nothing, seeing all these things that are happening to the Catholic Church, the persecution, the bombing of churches, religious freedom, the governmental mandates, and you know what? They say absolutely nothing. My grandfather, my father, immigrants, Catholics, proud of their Catholic faith, they probably are rolling over in their graves at the apathy expressed by lay Catholics in America today. Lay Catholics, start doing something. Get involved. As Pope John Paul II, a good Catholic is a faithful Catholic in the civic arena. Get involved. Stop this.
Ambassador Ray Flynn, Ambassador Jim Nicholson, thank you both for being here.
Pleasure.
And we will continue to follow this story. When we return, child advocate Liz Yore analyzes the newly established Vatican Committee to protect children from sex abuse. Is it needed at this point? She'll also tell us about a conference on human trafficking she attended in Rome. When the World Over Live continues, stay right there.
Holy Father has decided to establish a very specific commission for the protection of children, so that the commission will be able to advise the Holy Father about protection of children and the pastoral care for victims of abuse.
This is Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston, one of the 8 cardinals advising the Pope this week on curial reform in Rome. As you heard, the Cardinal announced a new initiative establishing a commission that will study child safeguarding programs, evaluate guidelines for child protection, and programs of priestly formation. Now, this pastoral commission will include lay people as well as clerics. To offer her thoughts, we welcome back to the program child advocate and attorney Liz Yore. She served as the general counsel for the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and was Oprah Winfrey's child advocate. Liz, thanks for being here.
Oh, delighted to be here.
Now, what are your thoughts on this new commission at the Vatican? Is this really needed? In conversations today with some in the church, they feel this is resurrecting an issue that's already in the rearview mirror and it's been studied to death. You say what?
I say that the rank and file of the Catholic Church wants to make sure that this issue is always front and center. And this Pope is a leader, Raymond. He is going to lead. He wants to ensure that we have state-of-the-art issues, policies, protection for children. I thought it was quite interesting today. There was a comment. He was asked by a teenager, if you could perform a miracle, what would the one thing you would do, Pope? And the Pope said, I would cure all the children that have been hurt from child abuse and from other injuries. This is a Pope that has a heart for children, and I think the rank and file want to see this kind of leadership coming from the Vatican. And we know this issue is not going to go away.
Yeah, no, it's an important perception. I agree with you. The Vatican reported earlier this year, Liz, that only a quarter of the world's bishops' conferences had put into place child protection policies. Is this a response to that, do you think?
I think it's a response to that. I think it's a response to the UN. You know, we look through everything through the lens of the American Catholic Church. It's a big world, and the Pope needs to address these issues in Africa and Asia and every corner of the world where they're Catholics. And for that reason, he wants a unified system that will ensure that children are protected. This is the most important issue, I believe, to Catholics in the pew. It's often the reason that people say that they've left the church is because they don't have confidence that the Vatican and the bishops will protect children in the Catholic Church.
Let's touch for a moment. The UN was asking the Vatican to offer up information on its internal investigation of these sex abuse, clerical sex abuse cases. The Vatican said they will not offer up that information. Some say they're holding out, they're holding back. You say what?
Is this the same UN whose peacekeepers were raping women and children in Africa and in Haiti? I say let the UN clean its own house. And it's also the same UN where Christians around the world are getting butchered and killed, and the UN is largely quiet and silent about this issue and calling it sectarian violence when Catholic churches in Nigeria are being bombed and Catholics are being killed. So for my sake, I think the UN needs to clean its own house, and the church, especially under the leadership now of Pope Francis, is going to be able to demonstrate to the world the gold standard in child protection, which I think that the UN, quite frankly, should take a page from.
I want to go to a topic that we have covered many times before on this program. You recently attended a Vatican workshop on human trafficking. First of all, how widespread, Liz, is this epidemic?
This is a global problem that's growing in leaps and bounds exponentially, as a matter of fact. What we learned is that the trafficking of human beings, women and children largely for purposes of sex, 80% of them, is a larger enterprise than the trafficking of guns and drugs. And it's quite simple. Guns and drugs are contraband that can be identified easily. Children that are and women who are being trafficked across borders are not identified as contraband. It is a $32 billion operation. Organized crime is involved in it, and it continues to grow in every corner of the world. And so the Pope wanted all of us to look at this issue.
How instrumental is the Church in preventing human trafficking, and what vulnerabilities do you see arising as the Church is really being pushed to the margins in the wider society and retreating from the social services?
Well, you know, the Church has been the choke points in the supply and demand chain of human trafficking. Prevention programs like orphanages, schools in the African bush, prayer programs, catechesis programs, soup kitchens, those are all prevention programs for preventing children from being trafficked, from women being exploited. This is the work that the Church has done for generations. And what has happened, for example, in Illinois, where I came from, where the Catholic Church for over 50 years through Catholic Charities has provided adoption and foster care services to abused and neglected children. Because of the same-sex marriage movement in the U.S., the ACLU, the Catholic Church has now been eradicated from that entire field. Catholic Charities was our best agency. And so what's happened in the last 2 years? The number of children in Illinois who have been killed, abused and neglected children who have been murdered, has been the highest we've ever seen in 30 years. I mean, I think we're going to see this everywhere where the Church is being, as you say, Raymond, pushed to the margins, is that the great work, Catholic Charities was the finest agency, private agency that we had. We know that with the human trafficking grant that the bishops oversaw, and we're now no longer have that grant. The excellence work of the Catholic Charities is now being trumped by ideology. And who's going to get hurt? Children.
You've once said that we can't incarcerate ourselves out of this problem, and I guess the Church was one of the great bastions sort of protecting these kids, and we're talking about 300,000 young people in the United States trafficked for sex purposes, 30 million estimated worldwide. What's the newest trends propelling this human trafficking, the latest markets, if you will?
The latest markets, which we learned at the Vatican conference, is that because of the same-sex movement, marriage movement, now the commodity is babies. Everybody wants babies. And so they're seeing a huge spike in surrogacy, wombs for rent. And so what happens? It is the poor, vulnerable women who are kidnapped, who are raped, impregnated, their children are sold to couples in the wealthy countries who are demanding children. And so as a result, we're also seeing the trafficking of human eggs. I think we have to take a very close look at this. This is one of the reasons why the commodification of children is why the Catholic Church has fought so just vigorously against this issue, is that it is always children that pay the price. And now we're seeing in human trafficking, this brave new world, Orwellian methods are now being used to create children, however we do it.
Yeah. Liz, it's not only same-sex couples, it's also single individuals who are looking to obtain children and have children, create a family, if you will.
That's right. And, from my experience in 30 years of child abuse, it is a mother and a father that a child needs to protect them from the evils that we're now talking about on this show. The predators that are out there, the internet, the pornography. A child needs the protection, the nurturing of a mother and the protection of a father. And for that reason, children are being denied the mother and the father in this brave new Orwellian world of where we are manufacturing children for same-sex marriage couples and for single couples. And who gets hurt? The children. And we're going to have to wait 30 years until these children are grown up and will tell us about the pain, the suffering that they endured because of what is happening at this moment in time.
Liz, 30 seconds. You learned something about the Pope in Argentina vis-a-vis human trafficking and his personal ministry. Tell me that.
I did. There was activists from Argentina at the conference, and they told the story that in the middle of the night, often the Pope, as Cardinal Bergoglio, would sneak out, go to the shelters where they were trying to talk these women who were in sex trafficking rings, who were prostitutes, to leave their violent traffickers. And there the Pope came and talked to them and encouraged them to leave this awful lifestyle. I only know FBI agents who have a gun and a federal badge who are willing to do that in the United States. But here in the dangerous barrio of Buenos Aires, our Pope did this time and time again. He knows the streets.
Elizabeth Ure,
and I think that's why he's being a leader in this.
Thank you so much for being here. Her columns and other important resources, including how you can protect your children from human trafficking, abuse, and exploitation, are on her website, Your Children, Y-O-R-E children.com. Thanks again, Liz Ure. Well, that is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. By the way, if you sign up for my free e-blast, I'll send you exclusive content each week. Go to the center of the website, RaymondArroyo.com. I have some news there about my forthcoming children's book, Herman Durman and the Relic of Perilous Falls. And if you want me to visit your school, your library, your museum during the book tour, go to the website, email me at raymond@RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. We have an exclusive interview with Cardinal Raymond Burke of the Vatican Apostolic Signatura, the Vatican High Court. In the meantime, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thanks for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. See you next time. Bye now.